it's my pleasure to introduce and moderate this policy panel for a day that was devoted to macroeconomics, but that, as I understood, has been devoted mostly to inflation. So we really have the right people here on stage. They could have done it without me, really, so I don't need to introduce them. I will try to keep the time. Just to give you an idea of how we will spend this hour, we will have a set of questions that will be answered, and there will be a dialogue between François Villeroy de Galhau to my left and Olivier Blanchard to my right. At the end of the 40 minutes or so, there will be a big quarter of an hour for Q&As. So we have this macroeconomic topic that we decided to focus more on monetary policy / inflation, and maybe a little bit on monetary policy and fiscal policy stance. And we will start with something that was very easy for me to identify, because Olivier just put out a paper with Ben Bernanke. I think it was published at the Brookings, although you are at the Peterson. It was a joint publication on the causes of the US pandemic era inflation. And they use a very interesting framework on US data, which I think we thought could be an interesting starting point to kick off the discussion. So in this paper, and I will start with you, Olivier, you look at the roots of inflation during the pandemic crisis, bring forward a framework of analysis which sort of tries to identify the role of labor markets versus the role of what happens in product markets, to sketch it quickly. So if you can tell us more about what the thesis of the paper is, what the framework of analysis is, so that we can then investigate with François how this would fit to the Eurozone, what could the results look like on our side of the Atlantic, and what the reactions can be to this paper.
Good. For those of you who were here this morning, you're going to hear a shorter version of it. I hope I'm not going to contradict myself too much, but the only way not to contradict myself is to repeat myself, which is not a whole lot of fun for some of you, but let me just do that. So, again, I think you have to go back to the beginning of 2021 in the US. As you know, my paper is about the US, and I shall try to limit myself to the US. François will cover this side of the ocean. And again, there are these two views. Everybody agrees that the fiscal programs are very large. The last one, in March of 2021, by Biden, is nearly 2,000 billion. And there is a sense that that's very big. And there are two reactions. And there is a majority of people who say, well, that's may lead to a very strong recovery, overheating, but we don't have to worry too much because the Phillips curve is very flat. The effect on wage inflation is very flat, as we have estimated it. So we're going to get a very strong recovery with a bit more inflation, but there is no reason really to worry. And then there's a minority, of which I am at the time, which says no. I mean, the size of this package is so large that we cannot assume that the relations which have held for the previous 20 years are going to hold, that there's going to be so much overheating that you're going to see the Phillips curve steepen, a much stronger effect on wage inflation. The expectations are going to de-anchor. People seeing inflation are going to start thinking it's back and it's going to stay, and we're going to get a lot of inflation. And that goes on. And basically 1 year later, I think that we understand what has happened, which is neither side was right. My side was right in predicting high inflation, so I get some points for that. But the channel that we had all focused on, which was the labor market, which was the pressure on wages and then on prices, was not the main channel which had created the high inflation. So basically the labor market had behaved more or less the way the equation estimated on pre-COVID data suggested. Expectations had not de-anchored. The slope of the Phillips curve was more or less the same as had been estimated before. This was mildly surprising. But the action had been in the goods market, with prices increasing a lot given wages through a series of price shocks coming from the increase in the price of commodities and the price spikes due to shortages, which were the interaction between very strong aggregate demand, a shift in relative demand from services which were hard to get to goods, so double whammy on the increase in demand for goods, facing a number of supply constraints, the lack of chips, the lack of some of the deliveries of inputs, leading to shortages and very strong price spikes. The example being cars as one of the main examples. So in the end, we got the inflation. It was very high, but it came much more from the part that we had not anticipated, which was the goods market rather than the labor market. Now, if you use that framework, which is the implicit framework in what we did with Ben, then you get a story in which quarter by quarter, most of the action comes from the price shocks. In some quarters, it will be a very large increase in the price of energy. In some quarters, it will be a large increase in the price of food. In some quarters, it will be a large increase due to shortages. It varies from quarter to quarter, and that's where most of the action is when you actually do the decomposition. Behind the scene, you have overheating in the labor market, which is leading to steady pressure on wage inflation. But it's a small part of the story, and it's hidden by the very large movements coming from the price shocks. What we find is because expectations are anchored, you don't get much persistence of the price shocks. When there's an increase in the price of energy, the effect on expectations of inflation, short-run expectations and long-run expectations, is very small. So it doesn't lead to a kind of wage price spiral that we had seen in the 70s. So it comes and it goes, and then another shock comes and it goes. To finish, looking forward, what has happened now for 3 or 4 quarters is that the price shocks have stabilized or reversed. The price of many of the commodities has come down a lot. The price of energy has stabilized. The price of food continues to increase, and there are still some shortages. But that part of the story is clearly coming to an end. In expected value, there might be another shock, but in expected value, this goes away. And what remains is the overheating in the labor market and the fact that over time, it has led to higher wage inflation than is consistent with the 2% target of the Fed, or the 2% target of the ECB, but the 2% target. To get there, the Fed has to basically increase unemployment. The labor market is too tight, and therefore the only way to slow things down is to have higher unemployment. How much is difficult, and I discussed to assess, and I explained why this morning, but my guess is that, to use an expression which seems to be very popular these days, the last mile, which is to go from 4 to 2, is a really tough mile. And if you want to do it quick, it probably requires a substantial increase in unemployment. That raises the issue of the speed at which you should do this last mile, and whether you should even do it, which is another issue, and we'll come back to that. So this is a 5-minute summary of the paper.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And I think this is a very natural transition to you, François, because we've spoken about the sequence of those factors that explain inflation. What can you say about how this view or this story fits to the euro area developments, or maybe the French developments, how this fits inflation persistence, how do inflation expectations have behaved, and once you've done the diagnosis, what kind of policy predicament that would dictate?
These are many questions, Natacha, in 5 minutes, but let me first say good evening et bonsoir à vous tous. Dire comme je suis heureux d'être là. Afterwards, I will speak in English. On Olivier's views on the US, I agree. And on its transposition to the euro area, Olivier, if I may, I agree still more. So if I look ex post at the roots of inflation, it's in our case a price shock focused on commodities. I have some slides, but I will skip them for the purpose of time. If I look ahead, the labor market will be probably the key question. And then comes the question whether we have a chance of a soft landing or not. I will not say anything about the US. I have no further comment on your analysis. If I come to this side of the Atlantic and the euro area, let me focus perhaps a bit more on the French labor market. I understand, Olivier, you are working on a wage equation for the euro area. It's not that easy because there is probably significant heterogeneity. But let me take the 4 components of your wage equation and try to see how they could evolve in the French case. First component is this famous degree of tightness of the labor market, so vacancies to unemployed. We know it's quite different. On the US, it's 1.8 or something like that. Difficult to assess in the euro area because we don't have a precise harmonized measure, but we know that it's less than 1. And if I take France, it's probably less than 0.5. Second, inflation expectations. They remain rather well anchored. But I will elaborate a bit more on the 2 last components, which has a catch-up effect, so loss in real wages in the past, and productivity. Let me perhaps take these 2 terms and add a third one, which is corporate margins. And there is obviously a relation, but take the triangle, real wages, productivity, and corporate margins. If I look at real wages, they decreased. It's not a huge decrease. I give you the figure average for France, minus 1% last year, and we expect minus 0.9 this year. So there is a potential catch-up effect, but employment increased significantly in the same time, which was a surprise. Which means that if I look not at real wages, but at purchasing power for the average French citizen, it remains stable due to employment creations. This could limit the catch-up effect. And this, by the way, means that we have decreasing productivity. So these are the 2 first corners of the triangle, slight decrease of real wages, but decrease of productivity. Which means that if I come to the third corner of the triangle, corporate margins, very difficult to assess. There are significant differences across sectors and across countries in the euro area. But in the French case, it's at most flat as an average. It even slightly decreased. If I say you what we expect for France, and we think the catch-up effect will be limited for the reasons I mentioned, we think we could have a peak in nominal wages in the second half of this year, between 5 and 6%. And by the way, we thought 3 months earlier in March that this peak would be higher. So we are a bit more confident today than 3 months ago. And we believe in a soft landing, including on inflation. It does not mean immaculate disinflation, and I don't like this episode. We are not yet in the last mile, by the way, but we will have a significant slowdown, but in our view, not a recession. So disinflation without recession, with a forecast of inflation coming back towards 2% by 25. This is, by the way, our forecast for France as well as for the euro area. And so we are probably more confident on some kind of soft landing, which is not immaculate, but and which is not without pain because there is a slowdown, but we are more confident on this side for the reasons I explained.
The comparison between the US and Europe is clearly extremely interesting. And I think the big issue is the degree of overheating on both sides, because it's going to determine what monetary policy should do. Now, I think in the US, there is really no question that there is overheating. That all the measures we have suggest that it's okay. So conceptually, the Fed has to slow down the economy. Now, whether there is overheating in the Eurozone is slightly less obvious. And again, there are differences across countries. But as a zone, it's not completely obvious. And then this raises the question, suppose there was no overheating, but wage inflation is a bit high, what should the ECB do? And there's a sense in which, in this case, maybe it doesn't need to do as much as the Fed. I think that's a relevant point. So the issue of overheating, I think, is going to be the central one in discussions on this side. Then two questions to François. The first one is V over U. So we have series for vacancy over unemployment, but indeed the levels are incredibly different between the two sides of the Atlantic permanently. So the 0.5 that you mentioned, is it a high value for the French series, or is it a normal value? Because that's what we want to do. There's a puzzle of why is it that the vacancy unemployment ratio seems to be twice as high, in general, in the US as it is in Europe. And I've not seen a good explanation for it. And then the other question, and I'll stop there, is on the real wages, the numbers you gave are before transfers and subsidies. And as we know, fiscal policy has been quite active, and I think has limited the fall in real income quite a bit, even ignoring the employment effect. And I suspect that that's a very good thing from the point of view of catch-up, because if you have lost less, there is less to get back. And I think it's relevant.
No, I agree on the second point, and I think it's extremely important. There are two different measures. Real wages, I gave the figure, but if you look at average purchasing power, pro-French citizens, it remains flat. And we expect more or less the same thing this year. If I say this publicly in French radio, nobody will believe me. And we tried to explain why the perception is so negative on the purchasing power. There are probably two reasons, at least. The first one is that daily purchases, so to say energy last year and food this year, are much more expensive than average inflation. So perceived inflation is much higher. And the second one is the one you mentioned, fiscal subsidies, etc., which help for purchasing power, including the one I mentioned, which is the favorable evolution of employment, which also helped for purchasing power. If it will limit the catching up effect in the future, we will see. We expect, as I said, next year a catch-up of real wages, but due more to a time lag. Salaries go behind prices. But we don't think that this catch-up effect will be significant, or will be significant at the point that it leads to a price-wage spiral. I could say it this way. We don't see a price-wage spiral in France and in the euro area as an average. Your first question was about V over U. It's true that structurally it's much lower in Europe. If we look at the evolution, it increased in France and in the euro area. So you could say that the tendency is a bit more tight on the labor market, but there remains a significant difference. When we have 7% unemployment in France, and this is a structural difference, unfortunately, it means that even if many people are not qualified enough to re-enter the job market easily, it remains a structural difference. Mm.
So you're saying that what might have been a bit of a mitigating factor for the ECB in terms of less overheating or no overheating versus the US, but with a strong nominal wage growth, this is not so much of an issue on aggregate, but don't you think that the heterogeneity across countries may pose difficulties for the diagnostic?
No, there are heterogeneities, but as I said, our analysis of no wage price spiral, while we look at wages with caution, is true not only for France, but for the euro area as an average. I speak only about the average.
That's clear, and that's understood.
Let me just say something on this, because once upon a time, I got very much in love with the wage price spiral, but this was inspired by the events of the 70s, where clearly it was there. And clearly there today, it's not there. I mean, expectations, and thanks to François and his friends, expectations have been incredibly anchored. And they react to inflation. The short run reacts to inflation, but the long run really doesn't. And as a result, it's, basically when workers see high inflation, they accept the idea that it's not going to last forever. And that just stops the wage price spiral. It's very striking.
If I may have a sentence off the record, your announcement, Olivier, of the death of the wage price spiral is very good news. If you could make the same announcement in Germany and Netherlands, it would be very useful.
That's a clear. Is it Chatham House here? I don't know, but maybe we move to the second. Do you want to react to that, or?
No, it's fine.
Okay, there will be questions and answers anyway afterwards. But thank you very much for your openness, both. The second topic we will touch upon is really the monetary fiscal policy nexus at the current stage, given the fact that a lot of fiscal stimulus has been injected since 2020, even since before, if you want to go back earlier. Some countries still have, are still running deficits, while the conjunctural developments might call for a bit less of stimulus. Maybe I start with you, François, but I ask the same question to you both. Would you characterize the environment in the euro area as one of fiscal dominance? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, should governments take their time to normalize the fiscal stance, given other priorities and for a given, state of fiscal fundamentals? And the third is fiscal monetary policy coordination, for which, in particular in the euro area, but for the Fed, for the reasons that were already mentioned, the adjustment of the stance is likely to remain fairly bold. So those are the three parts of the monetary fiscal question.
Thank you, Natacha. Let me take your points 1 and 3. Point 1 is very simple. I see nothing like fiscal dominance on monetary policy in the euro area. I see none of my colleagues subject to fiscal dominance. And let me perhaps insist, looking at some remarks in the last day, I see no political dominance either. I come to point number 3, and here it's more tricky, about fiscal monetary coordination, because we all wish it, but monetary policy is run by an independent authority, and it's important, so coordinating is not that easy. It was easy in the COVID years, because both policies had to accommodate, and they were very efficient so. And by the way, I supported the quoi qu'il en coûte, whatever it takes in France, which is not that often for the central bank supporting deficit and public debt. Now both policies have to tighten. We can discuss about the pace, but obviously coordination is more difficult in this direction for obvious political reasons. It's easier for fiscal authorities to accommodate than to tighten. So let me perhaps have some remarks on France in this regard again. First, I welcome the commitment by the French finance minister and the 5-year plan presented in Assises des Finances Publiques 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago in Bercy, with a 3% deficit objective for 27. That said, we must deliver. And let me insist on that. Our track record in the last 2 decades is really very bad. We never delivered on our pluriannual commitments. And let me be a bit more specific at French figures. If I look at our own forecast, without new legislation, etc., so there could be new measures. But we would have a difference of public debt ratio to GDP between the peak of 29, COVID, and 25, which is the horizon of our forecast. We would have a very minor decrease in France of only 1%. And we would have for the euro area as a whole -8%. This is really a challenge. We are not on the right track. And second, we are at risk of having this year in France the highest public deficit of the euro area. So here we must change course, or we must be very serious about our commitments. How to do that? It could be a long story, but let me mention 3 points. Third, it's time to come out of the fiscal subsidies for energy. They were warranted at the start, I signal I'm just coming back from Sintra. There is a very good paper from Pierre-Olivier Blanchard about the usefulness of these temporary measures, but precisely if they are temporary. So this is an obvious spending cut. Second, we shouldn't add unfunded tax cuts, and I said it several times. And first, and more structurally, I really believe we have space for public transformation and increase efficiency of our public spendings and public services. Let me insist on a very simple figure you all know. If I look at the level of public expenditures compared France and the rest of the euro area, we have more or less the same social model, and I strongly believe in this social model. But there is a 9 points of GDP differences between the 58 in France and 49% average of GDP in the euro area. So I don't say it's that easy, etc., but it's really time to start this public transformation.
Very clear. Olivier?
We agree on this, is that the fiscal spending which has taken place over the last 3 years was needed. I think it was much too large in the US, was quite reasonable in France, but there are times when you actually want to spend more, and these were good times, and good times to do it. As we have indicated, it might actually have decreased the desire to catch up and have decreased inflation that came and may come. So I think there are times when you want to do it. Now the question, the meta question is, what happens now? We have very high debt levels, and we have a lot of needs. And so how should we think about this? So there are various dimensions here. As you know, I've written a book recently on fiscal policy, on the low rates, which came at the wrong time because rates were increasing. It was not the ideal time to come out. But I still think that's the fundamental issue. What are rates going to be in the next 5-10 years? If they are very low, we can afford. It's not that it's a good thing to have debt, but we can afford the debt. It's not catastrophic. If rates are high, then we need to actually do much more than we would otherwise. So this is the discussion known as R star, and it's very hard to know. I would say two things. First, I'm not sure what the answer is. I think that we're going to get lower rates. It's based on two aspects. The first one is I cannot ignore the previous 30 years in which there was a steady decline in R star in basically all advanced economies, steady, having very little to do with crisis just happening. So there were clearly very strong structural forces at work. And then the question is, has COVID eliminated all these, or are they still there waiting to come back? And I think the answer is, for most of them, they're waiting to come back. One is not. I think it's investment. We're going to have to invest more, and that should put pressure on interest rates. So this is one reason why we might have high rates. The other is that people are obsessed with the current rates. Two things. They are not very high in the first place. They are still negative in the short run. And even if the ECB continues to increase them a bit, which I think it will, they are still not going to be very high. But we have to realize that that's really because of the fight against inflation. And looking forward, this fight will eventually be won. And we'll go back to where we would have been absent the inflation. And so in the end, what does this imply? It implies, I think, that we can expect lower rates than today, maybe not as low as we had pre-COVID, because of the reason I gave you, which is, I think, the fight against global warming, which is the main reason. But again, this obsession with debt is not fully justified if debt service is very low. And debt service has been low, and I expect. So I don't think we're very close to a catastrophe. At the same time, I think François is completely right. If you look at the increase in debt, not just in France, but in the US, in Italy, and elsewhere, and you give a pass for the reaction to the global financial crisis, which created a bump, and then another pass to the COVID crisis, you don't explain much of the increase. Much of the increase has been due to the deficit bias of politicians, policymakers who prefer to have a deficit rather than taxes. So it's clear that we cannot be completely relaxed. So this gets to the last point I want to talk about, which is fiscal rules, which is, an issue which at this stage is making a number of people have sleepless nights.
I hope so. If they sleep very well, it would be the worst situation.
I've done my best to contribute to those sleepless nights on others. What do we want? And we clearly do not want debt to explode, right? That's very clear. Debt is not very bad, but it's bad, and we surely don't want to take the risk of it exploding. So what I have suggested myself is basically to do what's known as SDSAs, which are stochastic debt sustainability analysis, which is looking at each country, looking at their commitments, looking at their expenses, trying to see where it's going, taking into account the uncertainty, and seeing how likely it is that debt will not explode. I think from an economic, non-policy point of view, that's clearly the right way of thinking about it, rather than some number out of nowhere, 3% or 60%. The issue is that for a number of countries, namely Germany, that's not good enough. They think that it can be squeezed and it's not strong enough, and they want numbers. And I think the issue is to find something in between. At this stage, the compromise, as the new proposal from the Commission, is, I think, a bad one, which is that they have accepted the notion from Germany that there should be a reduction in the debt to GDP ratio, kind of no matter what. 0.5% for the countries which have relatively low debt, 1%. Doing this, ignoring the macro implications, ignoring the various complications of the world, will get us back to the kind of either catastrophe or cheating, which we got before. So at this stage, it's a very fascinating issue. Can we find a set of fiscal rules which is sufficiently flexible, but at the same time prevents bad behavior? And I hope that they find a solution, but I'm not absolutely sure.
Are you optimistic? Yes.
No, fiscal consolidation, it's for sure an issue where there is a nuance between Olivier and myself. And if not, the debate would not be interesting. It's my job and my conviction to insist a bit more on fiscal consolidation now. Having said that, can I pay tribute to Olivier on two things? First, your work about G minus R. And it was enlightening. Are we sure that G minus R will remain sufficiently positive in the years to come? I'm not ready to bet all the consolidation on this hypothesis. This is where I'm a bit more cautious, but I acknowledge it brings right economic lights. And the second value added was your discussion about the content of the debt, if I may. And I can use also Mario Draghi's famous expression about there is good debt. And when I speak of public transformation and efficiency of public expenditures, I really regret it's a blind spot of our fiscal debate. It's not the same thing to finance with deficits and debt, which is on your shoulders, by the way, for all the students who are in the audience. We don't pay our own bills, we transfer our bills to the next generation, which you are. If it's for current expenditures benefiting to us, really it's unfair. It's a lack of solidarity which is obvious. If it is to finance climate, education, some expenditures of the future, it can become economically more interesting and socially more warranted. But we have very little consensus about what they are, and I would really like to have a discussion about the quality and perhaps productivity, meaning investment nature for the future of public expenditures.
Would you think that could be a consensus way to go about it in the discussion about the rules?
No, it could be, but I made, sorry Olivier, I made a speech 10 days ago. It was in Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, quite different from Paris School of Economics, by the way. I was not the only one to wear a tie there. But and I said that it's an appeal to PSE and probably to all the academics in the room and outside. I'm a bit impressed by how little help academic research brings to policymakers on this issue of quality. Let me call it quality. We don't know exactly what are the multipliers. We don't know exactly what could be the expenditures for the future. Some would say defense, education, climate, health, etc. If I have all the expenditures as future expenditures, I have not made any progress at all. But can we look more precisely at the multipliers and try to help with economic lights, which you did, Olivier, again, with the economic lights on these very difficult political choices?
Can I come back?
Yes.
So, on that consolidation, I think one can have, I'm going to caricature, one can have two objectives. One is to prevent substantial increases in debt, and the other is to reduce debt. And these are not the same. One is much tougher than the other. And the arithmetic of fiscal consolidation is a very bad one, is a very unattractive one, in the sense that suppose you start with 100% debt and you want to go to 90% debt over 10 years, 10%. Okay. You probably will have to have a fiscal consolidation of about 2% a year for 10 years, because some of it is undone by the fact that the economy will be weaker, right? That's really strong adverse macro shock. If monetary policy cannot help, because it's done at the euro level and doesn't reflect the specifics of each country, you're going to get low activity for a while, right? Now, what will you get if you succeed? You will not succeed. You'll be pushed out of power before this happens. But suppose that it succeeds, right? You're at 90% debt rather than 100%. From an economic point of view, it makes no difference. Now, it's symbolic. You've done something. But from an economic point of view, if you were in trouble at 100, you're in trouble at 90. And if you were not in trouble at 100, you're not in trouble at 90. So I'm not saying we should not try to reduce debt, but we have to understand the cost. The other issue is debt and the fight against global warming, which goes back to some of the things that François said. And there are two aspects here. The first one is indeed, to the extent that we do something for future generations, maybe we can burden them with a bit more debt. And I told somebody today about a cartoon which I love, which takes place in 2050, and the Earth is gone. And there's not a tree in sight, right? Everything has burned. And there's an old man there. And he turns to a young man and he says, yes, we've not done very well on the Earth part, but that is under 60%. And I think that captures, the essence of the issue. Now, does this mean that if we do the fight against global warming, we should finance it by debt no matter what? No, because if it doesn't yield revenues for the state, and if it doesn't increase growth, and indeed it might decrease growth, right? That's just like paying fonctionnaire. It doesn't make any difference from a debt point of view. So I think we just have to realize these issues are complex, but we don't want to put ourselves in a corner. I think the idea of having a lot of the fight against global warming financed at the EU level, with debt at the EU level, and being tougher on the national budgets may be a way out. But at this stage, I don't see the flexibility in the discussions, in the negotiations, which will get us there.
If I may only say, let us take Olivier's modest objective of stabilizing debt. Let us be clear, we failed completely in this country, completely. We were 40 years ago at 20%. We are now at 112%. So, and then there is this issue of content. And here we agree, probably. If part of this would have been to address global warming or improve significantly our education, I wouldn't be so sad or so critic. But we have used it to reduce taxes and for current expenditures. So this is why I strongly call on a debate on the content and not only on the figures.
Right. We have the views and the differences across them. We will take another 10 minutes to maybe wrap up. Now we step back a little bit, and I'd like to hear you both, starting with you, Olivier, on the lessons learned since 2020 in terms of monetary policy, maybe framework, strategy, objectives, and if you wish so, to cover monetary fiscal.
Okay. Now, you realize I'm the outsider here. There is an insider when it comes to my reports.
No, let me be honest. Olivier is a very powerful outsider.
Not the same. Anyway, I had made a list of the things that struck me. The first one is, again, the anchoring of expectations. And that's a major triumph because central banks have done a lot of strange stuff. And despite that, basically, I think their commitment to low inflation is there and believed. So they haven't done everything wrong. They clearly have done this right. The second is, on the less positive side, forward guidance. Forward guidance as a commitment is a joke. Forward guidance as explaining what you intend to do is good. But the notion, the time consistency issue of I'm going to commit because it's good and so on and so on, I think we've shown that it doesn't work. So I would stay away from any commitment type of forward guidance. Maybe François will disagree. The third one is on the Taylor rule. Taylor rule is great when you know R star. When you don't know R star, because the Taylor rule is about movements away from R star. R star in the short run moves all over the place. And so the notion that we should have followed the Taylor rule, which I think only John Taylor believes, is a non-starter. There is no simple rule. And I think that's reflected in the way central banks move. And then the last one is, again, the last mile, which is, do we have to do it? Namely, target inflation. For a long time now, I have argued for a higher target inflation, but this was at a time where inflation was less than 2%, and I was arguing for 3 or 4, and I was seen as a hyperinflator. It's a very different story now. We're coming down, and the question is, where do we stop? Now, I think central banks cannot say, we give up on 2% today. This would be crazy. But when we get to 3%, which I hope we will, and I'm sure we will, then I think the issue of how fast we do the last mile will become relevant. And maybe there we can have a discussion. I continue to think that target inflation at 3 would be better than 2. It looks very small, 1%, who cares? But 1% is what we got by QE, more or less. And QE is a very complicated tool with all kinds of side effects. So if we can get the same thing for an increase in target inflation of 1% from 2 to 3, I'd take the deal. It's not going to happen, but I'll keep pushing.
And that's useful.
I know François disagrees.
So let's
You will see.
I remember I was still inside when the forward guidance dancing was at its highest. So please, François.
No, as we have 5 minutes, let me make 2 general remarks plus 3 more focused ones about the lesson. First general remark, we learned modesty. We must keep him humble, agile. There has been many surprises. Monetary policy cannot solve everything. It cannot be the only game in town, and we should keep on repeating it. And we must be agile. So this is for me probably the most obvious lessons, including in the 4 other lessons. There are no definitive lessons. Second general remark, that said, and this was probably Olivier's point on anchoring expectations, monetary policy was efficient, first in preventing deflation after COVID, and this was a serious risk. And second, while preventing deflation, it did not create the present inflation. And this is important. Nobody can seriously argue that the inflation of today is a result of the monetary policy of yesterday. And this is an important point. I come to my 3 more focused or technical remarks. Less forward guidance. I don't say no forward guidance at all, Olivier, because I wouldn't throw it completely away. But for sure, we must be more cautious about forward guidance, which means if we use it again in the future, it should be probably state dependent and not calendar dependent. except for very short-term guidance. And second, it should be indicative and never fully committing. But again, we won't use it in the short run, but I wouldn't throw it completely away for the future. More caution. Question of the inflation target. I think it has helped. And if inflation expectations remained as a whole anchored, it's due to the credibility of the inflation target. And if we said we change it, but we know about the discussion, if we said we change it, nominal rates would increase not only by the same proportion, but probably more due to term premia and inflation risk premium. That said, we always repeated that inflation targeting is in the medium term. Last lesson, and for me probably the most interesting one today, about monetary transmission and transmission lags. This is probably the most important question today. And let me acknowledge it, we should work more on this question. We don't know everything. We know some things, but we don't know everything. I gave a speech 1 month ago summing up the studies of the Banque de France, and Olivier Gardier and others are in the room here. Our conviction is the following. Monetary policy transmission today is not weaker, but it's probably slower in this cycle. And let me explain why, and let me explain the consequences it has for monetary policy, and conclude with that. There are at least 3 reasons why monetary policy transmission is slower today in this hiking cycle. First, we start with very strong balance sheet from corporates and households, due also to the COVID policies. Second, when I look at households, the share of fixed rate mortgages is much higher, not only in France. In France, it happens to be 98%, but in most European countries. And this is good news for financial stability and also to protect the household. But it means that the transmission takes longer. It means also that it has probably longer effects for the household when they have the new rate. And third, and this is less often mentioned, the share of services in the economy is significantly higher than 20 years ago. And we all know that services are the part of the economy which is the least directly interest rate sensitive. I don't say it's not sensitive to monetary policy because it belongs to the slowing down of demand. But the direct effect of monetary policy is obviously stronger on housing or on manufactured goods. So these are 3 reasons why monetary policy transmission is slower. And we expect, the usual literature says 1 to 2 years of transmission lag. We guess that we are probably in the upper range. This means a very simple thing for monetary policy. Christine Lagarde, in a speech yesterday in Sintra, mentioned 2 dimensions: levels of interest rate and length. I think that due to monetary transmission lag, length is more important than level. Let me be still more explicit and quote our monetary policy statement, which we repeat in our last Governing Council. I noted it, so sorry, I read it. The key ECB interest rates will be brought to levels sufficiently restrictive to achieve a timely return of inflation to our 2% medium-term target. This is about the levels. And will be kept at those levels for as long as necessary. I think we are close to the former levels, but we should be sufficiently patient on the latter duration. To put it in other words, as transmission is now of the essence, so is persistence in our monetary policy.
Very clear. Yes, please.
Just one point. Monetary policy is a really hard tool to use, is what we just heard. I mean, we don't know how fast, how it works. And, I think that the ECB does the best it can. But there's an enormous amount of uncertainty, and François has mentioned some of them. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, works very quickly. When you give money to people, they spend it. And it can be customized much more. You can actually help the people you want to help, or the firms you want to help. There's a political risk, obviously, in doing so, but you can basically get the money right away where you want it. And I'm continued to be... So another argument also is the zero lower bound. But even leaving aside the zero lower bound, monetary policy may not be the best tool for macroeconomic stabilization. I'm not trying to close the Bank of France. I'm just trying to give you help. It seems to me that we should be...
No, but at least we are not at the zero lower bound in the present situation. So it was true some years ago.
But it seems to me that we have to go back and say, if we want to do macro stabilization, we really have two sets of tools. And we're underusing one a whole lot. I mean, to take the example, for example, of the US today, if you think unemployment has to increase, why should it be Jay Powell who does it rather than Joe Biden? I think that if you sat down, you said both should do it. So it seems to me very often, and in the case of COVID, we saw how fiscal policy could basically give the funds to who needed them. So I think that issue is an internal one, but we haven't made much progress. You have the automatic stabilizers, which are, whatever they are not designed for that. And we basically asked François and his friends to do much more. And that's unfair. The guy needs a break.
That's maybe a topic for tomorrow. I mean, there's the political and independence dimension.
I understand.
So we should probably go to the Q&A. But just to say, I strongly advocated fiscal consolidation 10 minutes ago. And we are now in the same camp, if I understand, Olivier. But
he said for the US.
we must also be realistic. I would dream of a world where there is perfect macroeconomic coordination between the two tools. And you are right, it would be still more efficient. But we are independent and political authorities have their own constraints. So it will never be perfect. And if the fiscal consolidation is not perfectly adequate, we should do our job anyway. So, but not overdoing, but do our job.
There's one progress, maybe it's the fact that the word fiscal monetary coordination is allowed now in the mouth of central bankers, while 15 years ago it was not. So the mindset is evolving. We opened for Q&As. So if you have a question, please raise your hands. I don't know if there's a microphone circulating, but you can. Yes, there's one over there. And if you can say your name and your affiliation. Thank you.
Jean-Olivier Hérault of PSE. So first, thank you very much for François Villeroy and Olivier Blanchard for being here for this debate. So many things, so many questions I could ask because the debate and the conversation was very rich. Maybe a source of concern, so has been said about how fast now we have to converge to the target. I think the speed and especially the fact that, yes, still the inflation expectations are steady, so in some sense it's a source of stability of inflation. And I'm quite convinced that the speed of the convergence is a bit very important, because it could at some point that inflation expectation could increase very large and could change totally the situation. So you mean by soft lending, so it's slow or fast, but I think we need fast lending. And it's coming back to the fact that now the mechanism is slower and slower, so it's a source of concern. If you in some sense make the summary of what you said, maybe a pessimistic summary, but I'm so a bit more concerned maybe that you are, or apparently you are. So it's my concern.
Look, again, as I said, when this started, I was very worried about the expectation formation. And I thought that in the face of inflation, people would realize there was inflation, start thinking this way. and have questions. When you estimate the equation, there's always an econometric answer. When you estimate the equation for the full sample, including the COVID period, the coefficient of inflation on expectations actually slightly smaller. So there has really not been any de-anchoring. And you can always worry that it's going to come. So there are people on the governing council of the ECB who always say, well, not yet, but it's coming. I think the evidence we have at this stage is that people are fairly convinced that the ECB will go back to 2. And they're probably willing to leave time to time. Now, we don't know. There's always a risk, but that's not a worry.
No, I would tend to agree with you, Jean-Olivier, that we need the right timing. So if I can use one of my slides about our forecast, slide 10, you will see it, a very simple one. What we say in our forecast, and I sometimes add it's a commitment, which is a dangerous word. A commitment is not a certainty, it's bearing new external shocks, etc., is that we will bring inflation back towards 2% by 25. And you see it for France on the left and for the euro area on the right. And it's our honest forecast, and if you look at the discussion when we published it 10 days ago in the ECB, it was not seen as particularly optimistic on inflation. But we think there will be a decrease in food prices in the second half of this year, and then there is a transmission leg of monetary policy, but what remains is underlying inflation. Energy prices decelerated, food prices will decelerate, and then we come to the core business of monetary policy, which is underlying inflation. And sorry to oversimplify in PSC, because I am conscious it's an oversimplification. But if we say that the full transmission delay of monetary policy is up to 2 years, there is some consistency in bringing inflation back towards 2% in 25. But again, it's our forecast. Some would say it's a bit too early. I don't think so, because it will not need a hard landing, in our view. Some would say it's a bit too late. I make the reasonable bet that with this perspective, inflation expectations will remain anchored. And by the way, inflation passed its peak in the euro area and in France. And this could change slightly, bring more confidence, and change slightly what we called 1 year ago the inflation psychology. We could see, I say it with much caution, some disinflation psychology starting to work. If I look at least, and sorry for this last remark, if I look at least at the figures we published in our monthly business survey of share of corporates, of firms which increase their prices. 1 year ago, in May 22, 50% of industry firms increased their prices in 1 month. This was huge. In May 23, it went down to 10%, which is more or less the usual share. So we will see, but I'm confident again in this perspective.
Thank you, François. I take the questions here on the row all together, and then we close. So Klaus, your neighbor, and the person behind you. And there was another one, I think. No? Okay, we stay there.
Okay, so Klaus Adam, University of Mannheim. So monetary policy is inherently difficult, but at some level in the euro area, it's also relatively easy. You basically do what the US does with a 6 to 9 months delay. And if you see them to be behind the curve, you need to do what they do currently. And in some sense, I heard you, François, being quite critical of the forward guidance component. What prevented the acceleration of tightening in the euro area was perhaps the forward guidance, in particular with respect to the APP, which then led to a situation where we hiked interest rates only once inflation was already very high. Now, question, would you agree to this rule of thumb? 6 to 8 months delay, so it's good of reasonable. And the second, then, given that the US is still hiking now, okay, isn't that an indicator that perhaps there is still some considerable tightening to be expected here in the euro area?
Thank you. We take the other two questions, please.
Yes, Carlos Winograd, Paris-Saclay, PSE. Well, first, there is so much common sense in this floor that we are not used to in these days that I really appreciate. As Jean-Olivier said, a lot of topics motivates, gives a lot of food for thought. I will, on the de-anchoring, makes me think like on this car, that is a Ferrari going at 280 kilometers an hour on a German highway, and the guy says, well, push it, nothing is happening. Keep pushing, it works, it's stable. One question on the debt. Trying to follow the common sense of the floor, we can say that the sovereign debt in the developed economies is high. It's certainly the highest level probably in 4 occasions in the last 150 years and the highest since 1945. Is it too high? I don't know, but it's high. If the markets read the idea of stabilizing the debt, knowing the political economy game that there may be adverse shocks, and every adverse shock is accommodated by a combination of fiscal and monetary policy, the market will read that with adverse shock, there is an asymmetry. With positive shocks, we keep the debt as it is. With adverse shock, the political system will lead us to react, and that may drive a continuous increase in debt from very high levels. How the market reads our lips, I don't know, but that may take us to an unstable path if that is the practical route that the market, I would like to have your opinion on what it says.
Thank you. And the last question, please, gentleman just behind.
Thank you. Alessandro Ferrante, student at PSE. This week, the IMF published a note on the drivers of inflation in the euro area, and corporate profits were one of the main driver. And I was wondering, what do you think about corporate profit and the profit price spiral? And does it create legitimacy to establish strategic price controls as Isabel Balear-Weber defended over her work?
Thank you.
Okay, can I take the first question of Klaus and leave the two others to Olivier? No, because Klaus' question is quite simple to answer. Thank you for putting the question, but my fair answer is no. I don't agree with this rule of thumb. Obviously, we look at what is happening in the US. Should I remind you that we have no exchange rate target, but we look also on the exchange rate effect on domestic inflation. But we have a different level of R-star. However difficult it is to observe, but everybody agrees it's different and lower in the euro area. Second, we have some common economic features, but here I would agree with Olivier, the labor market is not the same, etc. So we cannot draw the same conclusions. Can I add with a smile, Klaus, that if your rule of thumb would be true, we were much quicker than that. Remember, the first rate hike in the US was March 22, and our first rate hike was July. So only 4 months, much less than your 6 to 9. But this was only to smile. And perhaps more seriously to stress, there is always a discussion, should have we started some weeks earlier. But can I say 2 things on that? First, remember there was a very significant economic debate, early 22, about was it only a temporary supply shock? And should we look through it, which the textbook says. And clearly it was time to change course of monetary policy when we saw that it came to underlying inflation and it was no longer a purely temporary supply shock. But that said, we started to tighten monetary policy, not on interest rates, but on the QE earlier. We announced as early as December 21 that we would stop the net asset purchases on PEP. And believe me, this was at the time a significant step. So again, we can have a discussion about some weeks, but it wouldn't have changed significantly the results. And I think we must have our own curves, even if we go in the same direction than the US.
Thank you, Olivier. Le dernier mot avec les réponses.
Okay, 3 questions, 3 answers. On the first, I mean, there's a difference between the US and the euro is that there is overheating in the US without any question. And I think it's much less obvious in the eurozone. So this implies different monetary policies. So even if the US is going to increase rates further, it doesn't imply that the eurozone should do the same. On markets, so I've been doing some work on ratings, seeing what the rating agencies think about the level of debt service, and the political characteristics of a government in power. And what seems to come out is debt matters. They care about that, but they care a whole lot about the political inclinations of a government in place. And I think as long, I read the evidence as saying, as long as you do things which may increase debt, but that the rating agencies see as necessary or justified, such as, for example, helping people during COVID, then they give you a pass, even if that is high. And I think that, you know, the example of Japan, and maybe Japan will explode, but Japan is now at 250% gross debt to GDP, and the markets are not penalizing them, and the rating agencies are not yet downgrading them. So my sense is on that, what you have to do is you have to show that you're responsible, that if you increase debt, it's for some good reason. And I think in the current environment, if you do it as you've done it in the past just because it's easy, then you will not get a pass. But if you do it and there's a good reason, whether it's financing global warming or helping some firms for justified reasons, I think you can get away with it and you will not pay a premium. But that's I don't know. You look at me as if I have not answered your question, but that's my answer. And on corporate profits, greed, I'm very skeptical of greed as a macro issue. I'm sure that there are firms which have used the opportunity to do things they should not have done. But to think that it is macro relevant, I'm extremely skeptical. It seems to me that if you have a market, just to take an example, if you have a competitive market in which there is no supply constraint, so the supply curve is flat, and there's a demand curve, so EC 10, EC 101, okay, then there's going to be no profit under perfect competition. If suddenly all the firms find themselves unable to produce more than some amount, the supply curve is going to be an inverted L. These firms are going to make profits. If elasticity of demand is less than 1, then profit will increase in that competitive market. And I think that's what we've seen in many markets. There were shortages, people were willing to pay more, they paid much more than the cost. I think a good part of a large profit comes from there. And then you have the profits of the energy companies, which clearly are there, which were not completely offset by the losses of the other companies because the state came in and helped. So it seems to me that these explanations are as good as the greed one. The notion that firms became more greedy in this environment in a major way, I find implausible. Having not done the work, I cannot criticize the empirical work which has been done, but I'm skeptical.
All right. Thank you. We've 10 minutes over. That's still reasonable. So let me thank warmly our 2 speakers. Thank you all for being here. And rendezvous demain for political economy. Any other announcement? No? No. Okay. Thank you.